Okay, so in this video, we are going to talk about expressions. Expressions are a little bit different than equations because equations have an equal sign with two different expressions or possibly two different numbers on either side of the equal sign. Whereas expressions, you just have one side. You might have an equal sign at the end, but if there's nothing after the equal sign, it's an expression. Now you can do two things to expressions. The first thing you can do, because you can't solve them because we don't have an equal sign. So it's called solving equations, simplifying expressions. So if you take a look at the first example, the black example, that's an expression. Technically, if I wanted, I could put an equal sign here at the end, but it's still an expression because I don't know what comes after the equal sign. So I won't be able to actually solve anything. Plus, there's no variable in that black expression. Now, if you look at the blue expression, we have variables, but we can't solve for the variable without an equal sign. So we just simplify and combine like terms, which we're going to talk about in a different video. So the first thing you can do with expressions is to simplify them. The second thing you can do with expressions is to evaluate them. So with simplifying them, for example, in the blue expression, you might end up your answer being an expression as well and not getting one nice number if there's variables in the expression like in the blue example. With evaluating, notice we start with the variable in the actual expression, but it tells us what x equals. It tells us x equals a positive 5. So to evaluate, you would replace what we know x to be, which in this case is 5. So I'm going to put the 5 in the x spot. Now notice I used parentheses. I guess I should stick with the color black here. Notice I used parentheses, which is another form of showing multiplication. The 3 and the x touching each other, whenever you have a coefficient and a variable touching, means multiplication. So when I have that 3 and then I open up a set of parentheses, and that 3 touches the parentheses, again, it's multiplication. So to evaluate, you would multiply 3 times 5 and get 15, then add 2. So your final answer is 17. Now, how did I know to multiply before adding? Well, order of operations. So with order of operations, you do any grouping symbols that you see first. So if I go back, let me go back a couple slides to that first black example. Because the negative 8 plus 2 is in a set of parentheses, it's a form of grouping. So they want us to do that first. So any kind of grouping symbol, you're going to go ahead and do that first, which the most common grouping is what you saw, parentheses. So I'm going to put a P there. After you do any grouping, which could also mean a long division bar, then you're going to do exponents. Now, exponents is just a way to write repeated multiplication. So E for exponents. After you get done with your exponents, that's when you move on to multiplication or division. Multiplication or division. Now notice I wrote multiplication and division together on that same line, even though over here I put the M and the D one on top of each other. Technically this way is correct because multiplication doesn't necessarily come before division, it just depends on left to right. And then lastly, we have adding or subtracting. So the reason I wrote the letters out off to the right here is PEMDAS is what most people are taught when using order of operations. Sometimes we use a little phrase called please, excuse, my dear, Aunt Sally. Now the problem with this is it doesn't include brackets. So when people see brackets, they're like, what am I supposed to do with that? Well, it's a form of grouping. It doesn't include long division bars, which again is a form of grouping. And people think that you do multiplication before division. So technically, a better way to write PEMDAS is to write multiplication, division together, adding and subtracting together. So we might actually divide before we multiply if the expression has division from left to right before it does multiplication. So in the next video, we are going to practice simplifying expressions without variables using order of operations.